Look at everybody there. Awesome. Good morning. Let me get my screen shared. Good morning. All right. Let me make this. Yes, I'll be talking about that in 2 seconds. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. It is a Tuesday morning, which means it's time for Tuesday Training and Tactics. And today we are going to tackle some contract challenges I've been dealing with in the office, mostly the buyer broker compensation and the seller compensation addendum. So buyer broker agreements, seller compensation, things we love to deal with, right? Because what do we like to do? We like to get paid. So I'm going to start real quickly, though. We've got a couple of events coming up. It is Realty One Group's 20th anniversary. And as a part of our anniversary, which is on May 1st, we always give back. And so on May 1st, we'll be going to the Singletons, which is on Bell Road and 28th Street. We hope you will join us. And then if you're in the giving mood and want to join us again on Saturday, May 3rd, we will join other agents from around the valley at St. Mary's Food Bank. And then we want to highlight Rock Title is offering free, not free, sorry, headshots. They're $75. Spark Brand Creative is the company that is doing the headshots. We do need you to RSVP, so don't forget about that. We will be sending that those RSVP notes in our Wednesday update of all of our activities coming up. So you'll see that tomorrow morning on my midweek newsletter. So let's get started, though. As I said, we're going to talk about buyer broker compensation. I'm not sure why this is still sitting in the way, but we'll keep moving here. You guys can see that. So how does the buyer broker get paid in 2025 per the AAR contract documents? And if those of you online, I do not have the visuals. I don't have anybody here that's looking at the screen, but you are welcome to unmute if you would like to share. I also have some title people here who probably know better than the rest of us how buyer brokers get paid in 2025. If Roberta wants to answer, or oh yeah, never mind. Or Art wants to, but Roberta, what would you say? How do buyer brokers get paid now?
Well, I mean, for us, it's by a commission disbursement instruction.
For a CDI.
Yeah, but we don't necessarily get the documentation, but the buyer broker employment agreement and the seller compensation
addendum. Well, you get the SCA because it's a part of the contract.
Yep.
No, you don't ask.
On occasion, but
on occasion somebody sends it, but they don't ask for it. But they do get a copy of the seller compensation addendum. So the question is, who pays the buyer broker? A, the buyer, B, the seller, or both?
Yes.
The answer is, yeah, I didn't put a D, all of the above. B, C, both, all of the above, right? So either party can pay. Now, who doesn't pay the buyer broker anymore?
The listing broker.
The listing broker. Thank you. See, title knows the answer to these questions. The listing broker no longer pays. So it is either the buyer or the seller or both. So that is something to keep in mind as you're filling out your paperwork and why some of this paperwork is so important. Okay, the seller compensation addendum. Does the seller have to sign the seller compensation addendum if they countered it in the counter offer? Now, I saw a few of you online there, so I know some of you have been dealing with this, and I've had this question 3 times this week. Wait, it's Tuesday. I've had this question 3 times this week already. So it's Tuesday morning. So on the counteroffer, and these are literally from documents that I have received to review in our files. And don't worry, I'm not going to say whose files these are. I'm just showing for reference. So this was in a counteroffer. Realty One, the buyer's agent, will be paid a set fee of $18,250, and that reflects 2.5% of a dollar amount. Now, let me explain. This is not the purchase price. So they decided to pay the buyer broker an amount off of a different purchase price, even though there is a purchase price. So that's probably in conflict with a buyer broker agreement. It's probably in conflict with the seller compensation addendum, but they're not referencing either of those because they wouldn't know what the buyer broker agreement is. And they obviously are referencing the SCA, but do you see SCA on there? I don't see it on there, do you? Okay, so let's try this one. Buyer's agent compensation to be 2.5% of the purchase price only. Okay, so again, seller is countering.
As opposed to what? The purchase price only.
Purchase price only, maybe some extra widgets here or there, I don't know. But again, they're not countering the seller compensation addendum, right? So then we get, oh, wait, this was not from this week. This is from another contract. I just used it as reference of what you might actually want to write. The seller compensation addendum line 10 to be modified to read 2.5% of the full purchase price. So the reason that this language is here is it takes you back to the document you are trying to counter. Now think about it. If your buyer requests that the seller pay on the HOA addendum that lovely community preservation fee, right? How many of you have sold in Sun City and have a $5,000 community preservation fee or whatever it's being called, right? So there are plenty of times that the seller will counter that out, and you would counter it by saying the HOA addendum and whatever line that you're referencing is being amended as follows. The buyer's paying that, not seller, right? But you go back to that document. So the bottom one is what you as selling agents, listing agents, please look to do that when you're countering this, okay? So let me ask again, in these cases, does the seller have to sign the seller compensation addendum if they countered it in the counteroffer in these manners? Because I will tell you on those top two, there was no signed seller compensation addendum. And the agents called me and said, hey, they're telling us the seller doesn't have to sign this because they're not using it.
Do they sign the purchase contract if there's an addendum?
Do they sign the purchase contract if there's a counteroffer? Yes, they actually do. How about that? So let's start with the fact that both of those contracts had line 37 with a box next to seller compensation addendum as an addenda incorporated. So it is now a part of the contract, which apparently some of these agents just don't seem to remember. So see, seller compensation, signed, little box, checked. It's a part of it. So again, does the seller have to sign the seller compensation addendum if they countered it? Well, if they've made it a part of the contract, the answer is probably going to be yes. But let's see, seller compensation addendum. Let's actually take a look at this line for line, because I'll bet a bunch of you have not read it. And I find it fascinating that agents are countering out this language, not realizing what they're countering out, because hate to tell you folks, but there's more than line 10 of the seller compensation addendum. So first of all, it's an addendum, and yes, the seller could create a new seller compensation addendum and replace it. Not really ideal, but it can come from either party. So top part's not a big deal. The bottom says, the following additional terms and conditions are hereby included as part of the contract. I'll skip over the lease stuff, but it's part of the contract between the seller and buyer for the above referenced premises. So now we have two places specifically that say this is a part of the contract. So then we get to the part that everybody's focused on. Why? Because you like to get paid. I get that part, all right? So the seller shall pay broker representing buyer compensation, which may be credited, let's see, I can't see all that, in whole or part as follows, right? Check any that apply and fill in the compensation. So sale or lease, whether you're going to do a percentage or a dollar amount, that's your choice.
Not both.
Not both, nope, just one that applies, right? And it's funny because of course this does say full purchase price. So we know that one counter was specifically removing the purchase price and creating some other thing that they're going to create a calculation off of. Then it says the amount paid pursuant to line 10 is in addition to any seller concessions credited to buyer in the contract if applicable. Why do you think they have in addition in bold print? Anybody online want to open up and make a comment there? We got a quiet group. I know we got a lot of people online. You want to make a comment? No? Okay. So it's in addition to clarify that seller concessions are something else, right? Because early on, we were afraid that the buyers and sellers would misunderstand that sellers' concessions were actually the buyer broker fees. So this is to clarify if there are seller concessions written into the contract, that's one pocket of money. This is a different pocket of money. It's in addition to. So if you get rid of the seller compensation addendum and their seller concessions, is that clear? Could there be confusion? Maybe that's why they put lines 13 and 14 in there. Next, it says, this addendum provides the undersigned written consent for the buyer broker to receive compensation for more than one party to the transaction. Now, who would be the second party? The buyer, right? We talked about it, seller, buyer, both. Right. So again, if lines 15 and 16 aren't in there and the buyer broker agreement is for more, can the buyer actually pay the buyer broker? I would bet title will take care of that. But guess what? If there's a lawsuit, who's that going to come down on that this addendum disappeared and that it wasn't clear that there was another party paying the buyer broker, right? And it then goes on to very clearly state, and we talked about this back in August, right? Seller and buyer explicitly intend brokers to be third-party beneficiaries of the contract or the lease agreement pursuant to this addendum, and 8F has to do with the purchase contract, 9G has to do with the lease addendum, right? Or the lease agreement. Then it says the provisions of this addendum shall survive close of escrow. Why would that matter? We don't have anything on our contracts that survive close of escrow except for this addendum. Anybody have a guess why you might want that to have that phrase in there, buyer brokers out there? Oh, gosh, you guys are being awfully quiet.
The buyer broker agreement is out there. Can it survive past a close of escrow?
It sure can. And if you decide to close and not force your commission to be paid, it allows you as the buyer broker to pursue it in a court of law. So I don't know. I think I've said 4 different things that are important beyond line 10 in this addendum if it's not included in that contract. And I don't think our buyer brokers are understanding this. So the seller is just unilaterally saying, I'm not signing that because they've changed line 10. And you as buyer brokers, you guys need to make sure that that whole addendum is included to protect you and your method of receiving compensation. So again, you can do additional terms. Please, if you are writing additional terms, if you are not certain about them, please send them via text and say, hey, can I put this in the SCA? And yes, you can see everybody gets to sign this. So I guess I'll come back with, does the seller have to sign the seller compensation if they countered it in the counteroffer? Anybody want to give me an answer to that? Let's see. Yes, indeed, you do need to get that signed, okay? And for a lot of reasons. So please don't just ignore that. Just, it is a part of the contract. It was made a part of the contract. It must be a part of the contract. It continues. Any questions about the SCA? Oh gosh, you guys are quiet today. Okay. Well, you know what? We're going to go on to the buyer broker agreement because The SCA doesn't usually exist unless you start with a buyer broker agreement, but that's part of what we're going to talk about, right? So here's an amazing question. Does the buyer have to sign a buyer broker agreement? And we'll say either the buyer broker exclusive employment agreement or the buyer broker agreement to sell property. Does the buyer have to sign a buyer broker agreement?
Well,
100%.
100%. I love that.
Like not in your car until they do?
Yeah, probably that, not in your car until they do. So let's just say if yes, okay? So let's talk about, when does the buyer have to sign a buyer broker agreement? So let's see. A, before showing the buyer property in person. B, before showing buyer any property, including video tours to out-of-state buyers. So what I mean by that is your buyer's out of state and you are walking through a property on behalf of your buyer, either doing video clips or on a Zoom call or on FaceTime, giving a video tour of that property. C, oh, when you write the offer, make sure you have that buyer broker agreement signed then, right? Let's do it then. Or how about D, when you're updating into SkySlope? That might be a good time to do that buyer broker agreement, right? Anybody want to make guesses on this?
B.
Yes, indeed. It is B, before showing buyer any property, including video tours. Video tours are considered showing the property to that client, and therefore it does need to be before that, right? Oh, wait, I left out, it is not required to have a buyer sign a buyer broker agreement. So let's not add that, folks.
Only
Okay,
if
but
you don't want to get paid.
what?
Only if you don't want to get paid.
Well, you know what? That is a really good point. Let's get into that, right? What about you as an agent and a buyer? This has been some confusion. If you are actually the buyer, right? When does the buyer agent slash spouse have to sign a buyer broker agreement? A, you're not required to have a buyer agent or spouse sign a buyer broker agreement. How about B? Before showing buyer any property, including video tours to out-of-state buyers. Well, obviously you might not be out of state, but still, when you write the offer. D, when you're uploading into SkySlope. I don't know if I actually have E still on here. I guess I did. Oh, before showing buyer property in person. I switched that up. Hate to tell you folks, even if you are buying, if your spouse is buying, it is before you're showing any properties, okay? And let's take a look at this buyer broker agreement because there's really been a lot of confusion on it. And just to make sure you can see, this is the February 2025 version. Please make sure you are using the right version. Oh my gosh, the very top line says, notice to buyer. All realtors are required to have a signed written agreement prior to showing a home to a buyer. That is literally the first line of the buyer broker exclusive employment agreement. And I'm going to focus on that. I do have this showing property later. I do have it. Just wanted to make sure you guys know, some people are not aware that there's a little and that you can click on. It toggles from blank to and. If you've got two buyers, you can actually put that in there. We're not going to tell you you can't use it, but just thought might let you guys know that it's there. Okay, so we are going to go over all of this here. The buyer broker exclusive employment agreement, the BBEEA, is between buyer and broker in consideration of buyer's agreement to assist buyer to locate, negotiate, and facilitate the purchase of a property. Buyer gives broker the exclusive and irrevocable right to represent buyer in the purchase of a property during the term. Everybody got that? Pretty clear. I actually like the fact that this language is very clean. It says what you're doing for the buyer. You can have the conversation with the buyer on what you're providing them using those three verbs there, right? Locate, negotiate, and facilitate. Talk about what that means to you and how you will help the buyer in those manners, in those areas, right? Okay. And it gives the buyer gives broker the exclusive and irrevocable right to represent the buyer. This is the buyer broker exclusive employment agreement. not the agreement to show property. They are granting you that exclusive right. Now, the buyer has to acknowledge that signing more than one buyer broker exclusive employment agreement may make the buyer liable to compensate multiple brokers. Keep that in mind. And what am I doing here? I'm going over this contract. When should you be going over the lines of these contract, and should you be pointing out line 7 to make sure they understand that? And by the way, one of the reasons I bring this up is we've had happen this year, two agents end up, thankfully not both from our office, but thankfully they were nice to each other. Two agents end up having buyer brokers signed by the same buyer. And when the second agent asked that buyer, did you sign? Have you signed a buyer broker agreement? They said no. So I would change that question. Have you written an offer to purchase property recently? Because I will bet you that, oh, remember those when sign things, right? Oh, it got sent with the purchase contract, and the buyer did not realize they had signed a buyer broker agreement. So when you're asking people if they've signed anything, add that second question. Well, did you by any chance write any offers recently to purchase property? Because then maybe they need to go back and look at what those documents are, because you and I both know if they didn't get a buyer broker signed in advance, it got shuffled right into those papers in e-sign, digi-sign, authentisign, whatever they were using, it got sent through. And that buyer literally did not know. And that was over $1 million purchase that we had two agents trying to vie for it. And they actually cooperated very nicely, but still. Term. This agreement shall commence on a date and expire at 11/59 on another date, expiration date. It's your choice how long you want to write your buyer broker agreement. Maybe you don't want to be tied to that buyer very long. Maybe you want to test the waters. You can extend this, right? But if you make it for too short of a time, then are you covered if something goes awry? Perhaps you get them under contract, but then it expires and they don't want to go back out with you after you've spent all that time. So think about what a reasonable time for you and what you're willing to do with your buyer. Acceptance. Buyer agrees to all the terms and conditions herein and gets a copy of this agreement. If you are meeting a buyer out in the field and they're signing this, how are you giving them a copy of that agreement? How many of you have Adobe Scan on your phones? How many of you have an iPhone and ever seen that you have a scanning program in your notes folder, in your little notes tab? That app actually has a scanner in it. But if you are literally meeting somebody out, you know, at the first house they're seeing, and this is the first time they're signing it, you better be taking a picture and immediately emailing it from your phone so that they have a copy of this agreement, because they're saying they've received a copy. You need to be delivering that copy to them. Okay, so the buyer signs and the seller signs. Now or the agent signs, excuse me. I jumped around to grab 107, 108, and lines 114, and you'll see why in a second. But oftentimes people are sending these out via their electronic signatures. So we're going to talk about, we're going to finish this. Sorry, I'll get to that in a minute. We're going to talk about timing on signing documents in a minute. Employment. So broker agrees to. Now, there are a few people in this office that actually, under the geographical area, could write all of Arizona. But the most of you, you should not be writing Arizona down there, because I will bet you are not buying and selling homes in Tucson or Prescott or Flagstaff or Payson. And I do have a few that do literally cover almost the entire state, but the majority of you do not. So most likely, most of you are checking the box for residential. And if you do want to state a specific property under other, you could put an address there. If you wanted to do that, that's fine. If you want this exclusive employment agreement to be just for one property, I would use this agreement and put in that address. And then line 14, you could further expand if you wanted to put some other addresses there. You could probably squeeze in other addresses, but Typically for the geographical area, I recommend using the county, because if you're looking with somebody and all you do is put down Scottsdale and they end up in North Tempe, or they end up in Phoenix and not Scottsdale, did you really want them to be able to go to another broker and have all the time and energy you've spent on that wasted? So I would give yourself something broad enough. If you really want to do cities, make sure you're doing several cities, not just one or two. So that would be my recommendation. B says negotiate at buyer's direction to obtain acceptable terms and conditions for the purchase, exchange, or option of the property. And C is assist buyer during the transaction within the scope of broker's expertise and licensing. So that kind of is giving a little flag to the fact that there are things that are outside of your expertise and licensing, to make sure that the buyer understands that you don't do everything, right? There are certain limitations to what you do. So, oh, look at this, agency relationship. Agency relationship, it says on this buyer broker agreement that the agency relationship between the buyer and broker shall be, most of you are going to check the first box on line 18, as set forth in the real estate agency disclosure and election. I am not even sure what you would write in the other line. If somebody has an idea, please let me know. Let me run that past our designated broker, because I don't know why you would use anything other than the ready form. So next, it talks about property viewings. If you know that your buyer is looking at new homes, this is certainly something you want to go over. Notice that most of this is all in bold, that it alerts the buyer that if they go in on their own, that the seller or the seller's broker may refuse to compensate the buyer broker, which eliminates that credit against any broker compensation that's going to be noted below. So I would even say, please go over this with them going to open houses. Make sure they understand that they do have a buyer broker agreement and they are working exclusively with you. So it could be that you get a fast talking agent at some of these open houses, and then they call you and say they're writing an offer, and you're like, well, that's great, but you owe me compensation now. And they're like, what do you mean? So, and then it goes on to say, buyer agrees to review the Arizona Department of Real Estate buyer advisory to assist in buyer inspections and investigations. I think this is the first time I've seen this anywhere off of the front page of the purchase contract, where it says at the very bottom, the buyer advisory. So interesting, because sometimes when our agents are completing their pre-contract things, I get asked, what are the forms that we need to include with that buyer broker agreement? Well, it just said there were 2 forms that were just referenced, right? So what 2 forms were just referenced in this document? The real estate agency disclosure and election, the ready form. So how does the buyer sign this agreement if you're not also giving them the agency form, which just said that they're signing up for agency as described in that ready form? So please make sure you have your agency form with that. And then it talks about a buyer advisory. And I'm finding people are like, well, where's the buyer advisory? If you've been working with buyers, you better know how to find the buyer advisory. Now, there are 2 places to find the buyer advisory. Does anybody online want to tell me where the 2 places are that you can get the buyer advisory?
Transaction desks and Arizona AAR.
Well, you can do transaction desk. You can also do SkySlope forms, but AAR, Arizona Association of Realtors. And where else can you find the buyer advisory? What did the page just reference? Who wrote the buyer advisory?
Audrey. The department.
Arizona Department of Real Estate. That is correct. So it is the Arizona Department of Real Estate and AAR online. If you go to risk management, if you just hover over risk management, you will see the very first little icon says buyer advisory. I recommend that you email the buyer advisory to your clients, and that you go in and you actually print page 14 and save it on your desktop or save it in your forms for 2025. Make sure you've got the latest version. If you save just page 14, all our office needs is the signed page 14, which says you've delivered the buyer advisory to your clients. Again, if your intro email is saying, gosh, thank you so much for using me, I'm excited to be working with you, just wanted you to have a copy of some of these, the latest information, here is a link to the Arizona Association of Realtors and the Arizona Department of Real Estate's buyer advisory. This is updated multiple times a year. Please save this link, right? If you send that in your intro email and you end up going to court and somebody says, well, you never delivered, and you go back and show the court, well, that's interesting because the email I delivered very first had the link to that buyer advisory, and I brought it up every time I went over these different documents, right? The court is going to acknowledge your practices, the way you conduct your business, those policies and procedures of how you interact with your buyer is solid, because every time you meet with a buyer, you're delivering that buyer advisory. So again, think about different ways you can incorporate that buyer advisory into how you are regularly interacting with every buyer you work with. All right. We've got a few more, and then we're going to get into some timing issues, because that's the fun part I have with the buyer broker agreement. So this says broker compensation is not set by law. We've seen this. I have to get this out of the way here. Broker compensation is not set by law, nor by any board, association of realtors, multiple listing service, or in any manner other than is fully negotiated between broker and buyer in this agreement. Right? We have seen that phrase is multiple places right now, making sure that everybody knows that the buyer and the broker get to negotiate this. That doesn't mean you can't have your set rates. It just means that the buyer has the right to say, no, I don't want to work with you, right? Because they're negotiating with you. And if they don't get what they want, they certainly have the choice to find somebody else, right? Okay, so let's see. Uh-oh, my screen disappeared there. Okay, retainer fee. We are seeing a few agents begin to use the retainer portion of this. Title, have you seen a lot of retainers? Not a lot. Okay. We're seeing it more on our luxury end listings. Obviously listings, but on the retainer side of the buyer side, we are seeing it on some of our luxury buyers that just want to have some money in the pot, so to speak, based on their initial consultation, depending on who that client is. Not seeing it a lot on this side, more on the listing side, on our high expensive listings, of course. But then they do get a choice of saying that the fee shall or shall not be credited against the broker compensation. So you could certainly write, you know, to get me into a car and meet you, I want a non-refundable retainer fee of, say, $500. But it will be credited against the broker compensation once we get to closing. Right, it gets the buyer involved and participatory so that it can assist in terms of maybe getting them to go out and do stuff that they're able to work on those things together with you. I'm not seeing it very much. I know Ron is on the call. Ron, are you seeing many retainer fees on buyer broker agreements? Did I catch you off guard?
No, I haven't seen many. It's occasional. I have one team that does it pretty regularly, but that's about it.
Okay. All right. That's kind of what I thought. All right. So, broker compensation. If buyer entity owned or controlled by the buyer closes escrow on the transaction for the purchase, exchange, or option of a property, buyer agrees to compensate broker as follows. And we're referring to this now as broker compensation instead of commission. So you will see that word compensation. And it's always fascinating because line 33 is pretty clear. Check only one and fill in the compensation, which must be a fixed amount or rate. You'll notice I did not put anything in there. But let me give you an idea of some of the things I've seen. Oh, wait, okay, the box for the top says 3, and then the bottom says 4% on base price, which I'm sure has to do with, oops, I'm stuck here, new builds. So, you know, when you end up having a new build and you want to try to do that, can you write this way? Anybody online?
No, check only one.
Check only one. Thank
Well,
you
they
so
did check
much.
only one.
They did check only one, because you actually can't put 2 check marks on there. Although I think somebody tried to put it through the e-sign and put a check mark. So you cannot do that, right? So you can only fill in one of those. And I do know that the new builds are an issue. So one of your options with new builds, if you truly knew that your client is going to go look at both new builds and resale homes, you could literally do 2 buyer broker agreements. If you were to do that, I would do line 36 and check the box other, and I would probably put 4% on base price of new build construction only, and not have anything on line 34 for one of the buyer broker agreements. Then do a second buyer broker agreement with whatever your normal negotiated amount would be for line 34, and don't put anything with the new builds. And then in the additional terms and conditions, I would say that this buyer broker agreement is for resale properties only, so that you get the distinction, because remember, they're signing it with both of them with you as the broker, right? So you're not going to go after them for the other one by signing 2 buyer broker agreements, because it's going to be one or the other. And they're going to be distinct enough. Again, make sure if you're doing that on that back page where you have additional terms, make sure you do put down that it's only for resale properties. Does that make sense? Does that help answer some of your questions, folks out there,
Yes.
on new builds versus not new builds? Okay. Broker compensation shall be in U.S. currency and paid at the time of and as a condition of closing for the purchase or exchange, or as otherwise agreed in writing. Then it goes on there. This is going to get detailed, so hang in there with me, right? Because I'm betting most of you have not read through this, which is why I'm going through all of this. Compensation from a seller or seller's broker. Seller or seller's broker may offer compensation to broker. Buyer authorizes broker to accept compensation from seller or seller's broker, which really should now just be seller, because this has been modified. I don't know why they didn't take those out, which shall be credited against broker compensation. The reason I don't know why they didn't take it out is because the cab form disappeared, so it's really not coming from the broker. So I guess the broker could compensate, but pretty unlikely. If seller or seller's broker offer compensation is greater than broker compensation, the broker shall be paid the broker compensation, and balance is credited to the buyer, right? Now, of course, that's only to the extent allowed by the buyer's lender. The broker cannot receive any amount greater than the broker compensation from any source for services provided in this agreement. If the buyer broker compensation agreement says 2% and the seller is paying 3%, the buyer broker cannot receive that additional 1%. It goes to the buyer. Now, if the buyer's lender won't allow it, what are the options you have? I'm going to let you guys try to answer that. Jason?
Reduce the purchase price.
No. No. We're just talking compensation.
Okay, and I was thinking more of the contract as a whole.
Oh, well, okay. So yeah, I guess if you could do that, but you'd still have to change all the compensation, because changing the purchase price doesn't get rid of those percentages. Right? It just changes what percentage you're getting. There's still the percentage hanging out there. So you could modify your buyer broker agreement. If you're going to do that, you need to get specific language. We put it in our newsletter every couple of weeks. I rotate through some of those, but I do have language that our attorneys have allowed us to draft, which basically allow the buyer to agree that the broker is getting that money, but they understand they are potentially giving it up. Now, if their lender won't allow them to have it, I would bet they'd rather have you have it than have it go back to the seller. So that's the line of reasoning. Okay, so if seller or seller's broker offer of compensation is less than the broker compensation, buyer may request seller to pay broker compensation as part of the offer to purchase the property. So again, through the SCA, any broker compensation not paid by the seller or seller's broker shall be paid by the buyer. How many of you are reading through 44 to 46 with your buyers? That's the line that says, by the way, if we can't negotiate everything from the seller, then you have to make up the difference. The buyer needs to understand that as a part of signing this. We do have the disclaimer about VA regulations, what can be paid by the seller or seller's broker. So they are allowed to be paid that way. So failure to complete. Once a property's been located, buyer agrees to act in good faith to acquire the property and conduct inspections, investigations of the property that buyer deems material and or important. If completion of any transactions prevented by buyer's breach or with the consent of buyer other than is provided in the purchase contract, the broker compensation shall be due and payable by the buyer, right? So they have the right to cancel during their inspection period, all those things. But if they end up in breach, then it's not just their earnest money that could be at risk. It's also the broker compensation, because that's technically due and payable to you. So keep that in mind if you're having to go down that road, sadly, with a buyer. So here is where it talks about compensation after expiration date, right? Let's say this agreement ends the 30th of this month. You are under contract with that buyer and it's supposed to close May 15th. And on May 4th, that contract just goes away, right? Well, actually, hold on a second. So if that goes away, and the buyer goes under contract afterwards, you don't have unless you have within X calendar days after the expiration date, buyer enters into another agreement to purchase, right? It says during the term of this agreement, but if this agreement ends, and then let's say they go under contract and somehow miraculously still close within 30 days of that. Let's say you put 30 days, then you might have a claim for compensation. But typically what people are most concerned about is that buyer closes escrow on a property pursuant to the purchase contract that was executed during the term of the agreement. I've got agents calling me saying, oh, wait, my buyer broker's expiring. We don't close till next week. Do I still get paid? The answer is yes, you do, right? So even if you opened escrow within the term of your agreement and they close on a property, you are going to get paid. But I do recommend that on line 54, you don't put like 2 calendar days. Put something with a little bit of teeth in there to try to give you some time afterwards if for some reason they enter into another agreement to purchase after a deal falls apart. Does that make sense? But you are covered if this expires while you're under contract and you do close, okay?
Would 30 days be okay?
I would do 30, 45, something like that. I wouldn't do 5, 10. I wouldn't do that short of a period, okay? All right, listings. Brokers shall show property listings that fit buyer's criteria regardless of compensation offered to broker by seller or seller's broker unless instructed otherwise by buyer in writing. Now, this language was in there because of we originally had amounts that we could call the seller and say, hey, seller's agent, what is the seller agreeing to pay? Right? I don't think they've quite modified this form as much as they maybe should have, right? So if necessary, buyer instructs broker to negotiate broker compensation to be paid by seller or seller's broker. Of course, these negotiations shall not jeopardize, delay, or interfere with the initiation, processing, or finalizing of a transaction. But here's the thing. So if the buyer decides they do not wish to view property listings unless the seller or seller's broker has offered adequate compensation to the broker, the buyer can write that in writing. But let me ask you folks, how many of you listing agents are not getting an amount the seller's agreeing to pay for? Rather, they're saying, have the buyer put in on the SCA. And I can't see your hands, so just say, if you are not getting a specific amount from your sellers when you're taking a listing, that you're just asking for the SCA, just say yes. Wow, all of you are getting specific amounts from your sellers on how much they're offering? Somebody unmute, please.
Well, I asked and went with, what did we do? Can't remember.
Okay, I've got 16 people online. Somebody else open up. As a listing agent, are you getting specific amounts that your sellers are agreeing to? Or are your sellers saying, let the buyer send the SCA, I will consider paying a buyer broker fee and not giving you an amount?
Well, if I had a listing,
Okay, if
I-
you had a listing,
I would tell them to just put it in your SCA and everything's on the table for negotiation.
okay, so my point here is, and let's see if I've got this. These are from actual contracts I've recently received. The buyer broker agreements, excuse me, buyer broker agreements that have the additional terms. Well, first of all, this one is saying buyer instructs buyer's agent. Hold on, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. The top one says buyer instructs buyer's agent to negotiate their compensation from the seller. If you notice the blue lines up above, that's exactly what is already in the contract. Please do not write as is in a purchase contract because it's already there. And do not write what's already in your buyer broker agreement. So there is no reason to add the buyer is instructing the buyer agent to negotiate because it's on lines 59 and 60. So please do not add in terms because the question is, what else are you trying to say there? Right? So then the next one you'll see, due to buyer's financial limitations, the buyer instructs buyer's broker to show only properties whether the seller or seller's listing broker offers compensation to the buyer's broker. Well, with the ER having been changed, are you able to then show any properties to your client? Well, maybe a few. Be very careful writing this. I don't object to having it be written in there and having the conversation, but the next part of the conversation needs to be what happens if all I'm getting in response to my phone calls is please negotiate it in the SCA. Please negotiate in the SCA, right? So if that's all that's being given to you, what properties are you then showing? Okay, equal housing, I'm not going to read that. You've got equal housing, you've got other potential buyers. This is that our real estate brokerage that other buyers could be looking at the same property represented by the brokerage, making offers on. And if you're lucky enough, you've had two buyers that wanted to write the offers on the same property. And yes, you can do that. It's a lot of fun, but call me if that happens. It's a real pain. But seriously, we have 3,000 agents in Maricopa County alone, let alone around the state. There are probably over 4,000 agents in the state with Realty One Group. So those around the state are not technically a limited representation. Those within Maricopa County, both with Realty One Group and the new Realty One Group AZ, those are all would be limited representation. So just so you're aware of that. Release of broker. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but remember this bold section here. you need to be going over that with your buyers before they sign, that they're releasing and holding harmless and indemnifying the brokerage, from liability and responsibility regarding the buyer's selection and use of third-party professionals. If you are listing and giving termite inspections, plumbers, if you're giving any of those, I am hoping you are giving more than one choice to your clients, so they are then doing their due diligence on those third-party professionals. There are additional terms and conditions. That's where you might write the information regarding if this is only for resale homes, if you're writing 2 buyer broker agreements. Alternative dispute resolution is the method for mediation. We're going to move through here pretty quickly because I want to get to something really critical. Attorney fees, if this obviously goes to court, whoever wins is awarded their attorney fees. Arizona law, these are things you've seen before. These are all in the purchase contract, right? So these things have not changed much at all. So let's get back here to what is on the back page. So we have on the back page the buyer's signature and date, their address, telephone, and email address. I have never seen a document so well designed that our agents do not use it to their advantage. If you have just met a client and you are not getting their address, at least their telephone and email address, and saying our broker requires these lines be filled in, we're giving you the opportunity to have that easily to get that information. You should be making sure you're getting those details. And then on the bottom, of course, our company name, address, and your signature and date. Now, if for some reason in your electronic signature program that your initials end up under the broker initials there, you've probably checked the wrong box of who you represent. You probably checked brokers or broker instead of buyer agent. You probably checked buyer broker. If your initials do pop up there, please delete those. Those are not for you to sign off on. Now, this is what I really wanted to get to. Sequence. Who cares? Well, Ron's on this call, so Ron cares, but let's get into this. Term of this agreement starts on a date and ends on a date. We saw that earlier. And then we've got a buyer's signature and we've got the agent's signature. If you are sending documents out to be signed, how many of you are using the DigiSign system and how many of you are using sequencing? Does anybody know that in DigiSign you can do this, right? Add a signer group and it opens up another section that says who signs first. Who should be signing your documents first? You or the buyer?
Buyer.
Buyer, right. And one of the reasons I will say why that you should do it that way, and here I'm going to show you what it looks like on Transaction Desk with AuthentiSign. It's in both of these. You check that little circle box, the signing order, and you can end up getting different sequencing. You see those numbers there, who signs. If you click set signing order, it will give you numbers instead of everybody signing at the same time. By the way, one of our agents received a full set of documents with no signatures at all. And I just laughed because I knew that they hadn't set a signing order. They copied the other agent. So they got an offer with no signatures. So eventually they did get the signed version, but that's why you want that signing order. So preferred sequence, right? Buyer, agent, seller. Oh, I did not finish that slide. Let's just go on. Sorry. I want to show you this because these are real documents I've received. This agreement shall start on 1/1 and expires on 6/30. So let's see. Agent's signature was on 1/1 and the buyer's signature was on 3/28. But it gets better because the purchase contract was actually signed. Whoops, I can't see the date. Sorry. On 3/18.
Oops.
Oops. Right. So one of the reasons I was saying why it's really important for you to not sign first Once you've signed, do you remember you even have an agreement out there? You're not getting reminders to sign. It's not showing up anywhere. And it's not even when you go in, you might see that it still hasn't closed out. But if you send it to your client first and set a reminder for yourself that you need to follow up with that, how do you get from 1/1 to 3/28? Right. And first of all, of course, that's probably when they put it in Sky Slope. So, and at that point, it's that agreement is of no use, right? So here's the thing: what's at risk if the buyer does not sign a buyer broker agreement prior to contract? Who's paying the buyer broker? Well, if the seller's paying, the SCA is signed, the seller pays at closing, you're fine. Okay, great. That worked out all right, right? But if the buyer's paying and the buyer sends the money to title for closing, all right, you made it. Close one. But guess what happens? If the buyer's paying and the buyer refuses to send money to title for closing, or buyer demands the money be returned from title, title would most likely ask to see the buyer broker agreement. And by the way, does Realty One Group pursue your compensation in a court? Any guesses? Anybody want to answer that one? Nope. You're on your own if you want to sue for compensation. So, that's why we work very hard to make sure that you get these documents done in time. And I think that was my last one. It's almost 10 o'clock. I'm going to really quickly look at the buyer broker agreement. I'm sorry, almost 11 o'clock. Buyer broker agreement to show property. Honestly, unless you are at an open house and somebody walks in and literally wants to walk down the street and see a property, I personally don't know why you would use this form. You are basically saying, I'm showing you a property, and by the way, call me back if you want to write on it. If you don't, whatever. Because they literally can go find somebody else and write on that property. Same property, doesn't matter. If you use the agreement to show property, you want to show the property down the street from that open house, use the buyer broker exclusive employment agreement, at least lock that property and say, if you want to write on this property, you owe me compensation. That's fine. But I know a couple of agents that are using this a lot, and I'm like, why? Right? So broker compensation if broker represents buyer in the purchase of a property, as indicated on the purchase contract that was signed prior to the expiration date of this showing property agreement. So if the term up there has ended, doesn't matter, you're done anyway. So if you write a buyer broker agreement to show property and have it be for 2 weeks, fine, they can wait for 15 days and write it with somebody else anyway. But it doesn't matter because they don't need to come back to you. So just keep that in mind. I mean, it's there, but to me, it doesn't really suit you well unless you just want to write that you have the document to show a property and it's 1 page. There you go. That's the reason to do it. And really, the other document you have to give the agency. You should be sending the buyer advisory, but you have to be giving the agency in the beginning. So, okay, let's see. Again, those dates are critical, right? When is it being signed? And I think that is the end. I don't know how that ended up being my last slide, but there you go. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and get a chance to look at all these fun folks. Let me get off my pin. And any questions you guys have?
Melissa, can I mention one thing about the importance of extending the term of the BBEEA with the
Sure.
with the BTEAA?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to have you talk about the importance of what form to use, because I asked that question, do I need a new BBEEA? And you said no. And now I know, but I think it's important for everybody to hear this.
So what he's talking about is that there is actually it's called a buyer tenant addendum to the, is that right? Buyer broker
Buyer tenant employment agreement addendum.
addendum. There you go. Employment agreement addendum. And that's the form you use to extend the agreement. It's also the form you use to change and renegotiate the compensation amount. And again, you can renegotiate it. But here's the thing. If you're talking to your buyer initially and going over the buyer broker agreement, one of the phrases that I recommend you work on saying, get comfortable with saying, this is what I am worth. And this is what this is the amount that I want. I get paid, right? I do, whatever, find your verb there, but I get paid is this amount, whether that's 2%, 3%, $10,000, whatever your particular scenario is for how you interact with your clients. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't reduce it. And the first thing that buyers seem to want to ask is, well, what happens if we don't get it, right? And I think the bigger point of what you need to be saying is part of my job is to negotiate this compensation. And it is a huge part of my job to go to try to get all, if not most of this paid for by the seller. And hopefully if you've been doing transactions, you can follow that up by saying over the last, 8 months, I've successfully negotiated all, if not most of these on every transaction I've done. And that's XYZ transactions. That's fine. You can share with them how many buyer broker deals have you done? How many purchases have you negotiated since August, right? Share with them that success story, right? The last thing you want to do is say, I've done 5 deals and I haven't been able to get any buyer broker compensation from a seller. I think I would be surprised at that. I mean, I see the transactions come through. Most sellers have been willing to participate in the current market conditions we have right now, a lot, right? So when you are negotiating with a buyer up front, to say what your value is, to say that part of that is to negotiate that. But the one thing you cannot say is, don't worry, I'll take care of you. Because you've just rip up the document. Why even have it? You've just basically said the numbers here don't matter. So you do need to say that you will go to negotiate it. And you can then say, and you'll hear that I'm not even going to say the word compensation. When we go write an offer on a property, there will be plenty of things that we will be negotiating. If we do not get that offer accepted, we are absolutely going to come back and look at your entire offer and whether or not there are things that you want to modify and counter from what we received back from the seller. I didn't talk about compensation. I talked about negotiations, which is what your job is as a buyer's agent. So you can talk about that without, again, ripping up your buyer broker agreement. You are going to talk about all that. And one of the things when I'm working with, agents that have done this for a while that are stuck, if you had a seller, you had a buyer that needed buyer closing costs, they're doing a down payment assistance, right? You tell me any buyer that if they asked you, well, what happens if the seller won't pay the closing costs to cover my down payment assistance? You wouldn't say, oh, don't worry, I'll write a check for you. I got you covered. If I asked all of you that, I bet you anything, you'd all say, I'm not writing a check. But then why are you saying you're writing a check for your own compensation? What you would tell that buyer is, look, we know we've got an uphill battle because we're trying to ask for buyer closing costs for down payment assistance. So, if they don't give us that, we're going to have to look at what that counteroffer is and how do we approach them again, if possible. If not, that may not be the right property for you, and let's go find one that is. You would never say, I'm writing a check. There are lots of other ways to address that. So focus on your negotiation skills that you're going to put into effect with the seller, not with your buyer. Your buyer, you're going to protect them and work to get them everything you can. But ultimately, if the seller's not participatory, I've had sellers that have said, I won't pay a damn thing for a buyer. If they can't afford to pay their closing costs, they shouldn't be buying a home. Literally, I've had a seller tell me that, more than one seller, right? It's like, as long as you're getting what you want, why would you care where the buyer uses those funds, right? But you can run into that. And you know what? That might not be the best home for your buyer to purchase. Any other questions? Comments? Everybody have a better understanding of the buyer broker agreement and that lovely seller compensation addendum form?
Yes.
Great stuff.
Title's going yes. Ron, anything you'd like to jump on and share? For folks that don't know, this is our designated broker. He snuck in today. I told him I was talking about these two things. And he and I have had several conversations over the last week.
Well, I tell you, Melissa, you've done a great job with it. You
Thank
covered
you.
pretty much everything. And the part where the signature dates and contract dates and all that's why your broker goes bald. Just pulls his hair out when he sees things like that. So don't do that. I haven't got anything left to pull.
Your beard, you can start working on your
Pull
beard.
Oh,
No,
well,
I'm kidding.
people can't see that. There I am.
There you go. We can see your beard. Look, I got mine cut really short, just not quite as Bruce.
Melissa, I'm on the call too as Barb, not Lucas, if you need
Oh.
anything from the lending side.
I
I don't
think
know. I couldn't get him off. I don't know why my kid's on there instead of me.
Lloyd, you want to say something? You jumped on your photo there. Nope. Okay. All right. Yeah. All right, guys. Thank you so much. We'll see you next Tuesday. We have a special guest next Tuesday. As a reminder, Mandy Need is coming in to talk about some tips and tricks with contracts as well. So to stay out of trouble, come join our deputy commissioner next Tuesday in our office. It will not be on Zoom, folks. Sorry, she won't let us record her. So we'll take her in person only.
Yay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Melissa.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Melissa.
Bye-bye.